Hey, welcome back. It's Philosophy 1. This is Lecture 2 on Plato's Allegory of the Cave. As you can see, I'm coming to you from inside the cave today. Let's go to the notes for today. So, what's the story of the allegory? So, as we will see, an allegory is a rhetorical device. It's used to help explain things. So, what is the story of the allegory trying to explain? Hopefully by now you've read that. How does the story begin? How does it end? What are the prisoners doing in the cave? What happens with the escapee? What happens outside the cave? What does the escapee learn? What happens when the escapee returns? And what is the lesson or the moral of the story? What is Plato trying to illustrate with this allegory? So a short introduction will tell you that he says at the very beginning, this is to teach you the difference between enlightenment and unenlightenment. So the unenlightened are depicted as the cave dwellers, able to predict, for example, the order of shadows on the wall, in contrast with the enlightened one, who's depicted as ascending from the darkness into initially the blinding light of the day. So I wanted to share with you a video. Let me stop the share and adjust for optimizing for the video clip. This is from the School of Life. They have a bunch of videos on different philosophers. As you can see, this one's on Plato's Allegory of the Cave. And I want you to think about, as you're watching this, the difference between reading the allegory, which is a primary text, and watching something on a video, which is an interpretation of the primary text by someone who has an agenda, is motivated to share this material with you for a reason.
The ancient Greeks were emphatic that philosophy was not just an elaborate abstract exercise. It was, they felt, a deeply useful skill that should be learnt and practiced by all in order to help us to live and die well. No one believed this more than Plato, who was passionate in his defense of philosophy as a kind of therapy for the soul. One of the most forceful stories he told on behalf of the utility of philosophy was what has become known as the Allegory of the Cave. It is perhaps the most famous allegory in philosophy. This was a story that was intended, as he wrote, to compare the effect of education and the lack of it on our nature. At the start of Book 7 of his masterpiece, The Republic, Plato tells us about some people living imprisoned in a cave. They've always lived there and don't know anything of the outside world. There is no natural light in this cave. The walls are damp and dark. All the inhabitants can see comes from the shadows of things thrown up on the wall by a light of a fire. The cave dwellers get fascinated by these reflections of animals, plants, and people. Moreover, they assume that these shadows are real, and that if you pay a lot of attention to them, you'll understand and succeed in life. They don't, of course, realize that they are looking at mere phantoms. They chat about shadowy things enthusiastically and take great pride in their sophistication and wisdom. Then, one day, quite by chance, someone discovers a way out of the cave, out into the open air. At first, it's simply overwhelming. He is dazzled by the brilliant sunshine, in which everything is for the first time properly illuminated. Gradually, his eyes adjust and he encounters the true forms of all those things which he had formerly known only as shadows. He sees actual flowers, the colours of birds, the nuances in the bark of trees. He observes stars and grasps the vastness and sublime nature of the universe. As Plato puts it in solemn terms, previously he had been looking merely at phantoms. Now he is nearer to the true nature of being. Out of compassion, this newly enlightened man decides to leave the sunlit upper world and makes his way back into the cave to try to help out his companions, who are still mired in confusion and error. Because he's become used to the bright upper world, he can hardly see anything underground. He stumbles along the damp, wet corridors and gets confused. He seems to the others totally unimpressive. When he in turn is unimpressed by them and insists on explaining what the sun is or what a real tree is like, the cave dwellers get sarcastic, then very angry, and eventually plot to kill him. The story of the cave is an allegory of the life of all enlightened people. The cave dwellers are humans before philosophy. The sun is the light of reason. The alienation of the returned philosopher is what all truth-tellers can expect when they take their knowledge back to people who have not devoted themselves to thinking. For Plato, we are all for much of our lives in shadow. Many of the things we get excited about, like fame, the perfect partner, a high-status job, are infinitely less real than we suppose. They are, for the most part, phantoms projected by our culture onto the walls of our fragile and flawed minds. But because everyone around us is insisting that they are genuine, we are taken in from a young age. It's not our fault individually. No one chooses to be in the cave. That's just where we happen to begin. We're all starting from a very difficult place. If, like the man in Plato's story, you bluntly tell people they're wrong, you get nowhere, you cause deep offense and may endanger your own life. Athens had, after all, recently put Socrates, Plato's friend, to death. Plato knew from close experience just what the cave dwellers might do to those who claim to know the sun. The solution, Plato says, is a process of widespread, carefully administered philosophical education, by which he understood the method of inquiry pioneered by Socrates and known to us as the Socratic method. It's a very gentle process. You don't lecture or harangue or force someone to read a particular book. You just start with a general declaration of intellectual modesty. No one knows very much. It's always good to insist. And wisdom starts with owning up to ignorance. Confess that you don't know exactly what the government should do, what war is meant to achieve, or how good relationships work. You then get the other person to say what they think, and gradually, together, you investigate the answers. Most likely, the other person will be confident, or rather painfully, overconfident. They may tell you it's all quite simple, really, and everyone knows the answer already. You must be supremely patient with this kind of bravado. If they go off topic, you must cheerfully double back. You must take a lot of time and be ready to have chats over many days. This method of talking is founded on a lovely confidence that with the right encouragement, people can eventually work out things for themselves and detect errors in their own reasoning if you carefully and quietly draw their attention to tricky points and don't cast blame or ever get annoyed. You never teach anyone anything by making them feel stupid, even if they are at first. We have all started in that cave, but it is Plato's deepest insight that we don't have to stay there. And the road out is called, quite simply, philosophy. This is the sun whose light we can follow, and by whose rays the proper nature of things can become clear.
All right, going back to sharing the screen in the lecture notes. So one of the things you might have noticed that the School of Life gives an interpretation of the allegory of the cave, talking about how it's a way for understanding education in general, that we all start in a cave and that education is the process of coming out of the cave. But at the end, the School of Life video also points out how the allegory is an allegory telling us about the birth of Western philosophy, that the pathway out of the cave is not just education, but a certain kind of education, philosophical education. One of the things I don't like about the use of secondary texts, and particularly this one, and I'm pointing this out to you so that you have this in your head as you go to like look things up online and try to find more information about things we're studying, is that you may have noticed about halfway through this video, there was a scene where the cave dwellers were depicted as what looked like indigenous people, and they were said to be ignorant. And the images that were used to depict the escapee, the enlightened one, although he was nude, was always white. So, you could see some ethnocentrism in the depiction. And so primary texts are open for your own interpretation. When you're using secondary text, you're always using somebody else's interpretation, which carries the risk of importing, ethnocentrism, racism, transphobia, and so on. Okay, so if you want to explore more about the allegory of the cave, here are some videos you can find on YouTube that'll allow you to dig deeper, and these are also listed on the Dig Deeper page. You may have noticed the relationship between The Matrix and the classic movie from 1999, The Matrix, and the allegory of the cave, because those filmmakers use the allegory of the cave as a kind of thematic foundation for the movie. People also notice that it's there in other movies. Here's a video on how Plato's allegory is a way of using Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey, which is the basically the underlying narrative structure of many Hollywood movies. Jeff Koons' show at Plato at the Plato in LA was at the Getty a couple years ago. So there's some artistic and cultural popular references in case you want to go down that rabbit hole. And if you do and you find any good references, send them to me in the Canvas inbox. So how is Plato's allegory of the cave the origin story of Western philosophy? So an origin story might be for a religion. For example, in the Bible, the origin story in Genesis, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So what philosophers call this is cosmogony, a model concerning the origin of either the universe or the cosmos. And origin myths are part of what give a people a sense of their identities. So you're taking this philosophy course and you're learning Western philosophy and you're learning this sense of your long self. You're coming out of this tradition, whether you're an international student or you're, American-born student. You are joining this tradition, this study of what it is to be of this tradition, Western philosophical tradition, Western literary tradition. And so what is that story? What is that group or tradition you're joining when you learn about this and incorporate it into your worldview? Well, you might contrast it with, for example, the modern origin story of the Big Bang, which is a scientific story. And so that story is about, well, planet Earth was the product of a Big Bang, and then things evolved such that we are now living the reality we are here on the planet. But the origin story of Western philosophy is not a scientific origin story. It's an origin story that starts with a paradigm shift, and it's sometimes called the Greek miracle. And the idea is that before philosophy, there was mythos, story, allegory, narrative, and Plato depicts that as being inside the cave. And then outside the cave is logos, logic, reason, knowledge. And so the paradigm shift that is illustrated by the allegory of the cave, coming up out of the cave, is the shift. We are a people that come not from mythos, but from logos, is the story. That's some people will say that's ethnocentric, that in itself is a myth, that that before there was no logic and that we are the people of logic and reason. What is the philosophical context of Plato's allegory of the cave? So this allegory shows up in book 7 of Plato's famous treatise called Plato's Republic. It's really a series of dialogues, and we're going to be reading book 1 and the beginning of book 2 in this unit. And so the whole book, the Plato's Republic, like if you're going to any Ivy League schools in this country, if you're going to any of the UCs, you'll be reading in an intro philosophy class almost always the entirety of Plato's Republic. It's 10 books, chapters, which take you on a journey to try to discover what is justice. What is justice? But justice in the individual, what is it to be a just person? And justice in the state, what is it to live in a just society? So as he's discussing justice and this just society, the question comes up, well, what kind of leadership would a republic require? And he gives this famous quote: unless either philosophers become kings in their countries, or those who are now called kings and rulers come to be sufficiently inspired with a genuine desire for wisdom, remember, love of wisdom, philosophia, unless, that is to say, political power and philosophy meet together, there can be no rest from our troubles. So Plato is very optimistic that philosophy can be a road, a path to help us understand how we should live together in justice, justly. So the question then arises, well, who is enlightened enough to be a philosopher king? And that's when Plato tells the story of the allegory. So the allegory is a way of illustrating who is really qualified to be a philosopher king in a just society, and that is the escapee in the allegory. So I've been using the term allegory without defining it. An allegory is a symbolic narrative used as a rhetorical strategy. And that definition of allegory will show up on exam 1. It's a representation of an abstract meaning through concrete or material forms. It's a figurative treatment of one subject in the guise of the other. So one subject, the allegory of the cave, is portrayed in a guise to tell you about another subject. For example, what is justice and how is a just society organized? Who would be the rulers? I want you to download the allegorical framework, which is in the Canvas shell, right? It's posted in the lecture 2 on Plato's allegory. You'll find it. Let me just show you where that is. Let's go into lecture 2, right? So here's the worksheet, Allegory of the Cave Framework. Find that there. So I want you to print that out so you have it. Well, and I want you to think about the allegory in terms of your own life experience. We're going to do a couple of different interpretations here, because an allegory is a rhetorical device that can be used to say a lot of different things. It could be like your life experience, and the question then is like, what cave were you born into? What cave did you emerge out of in your life? When did you get out of the cave you were born into, discover the truth about reality? And when you came back to your home cave, what happened? It could also be used as a historical, to show us a paradigm shift. I'll show you how to do that. You could also use it to interpret The Matrix or The Truman Show, if you've seen those movies. So these are the symbols, and then you put your interpretation over here. So the sun maybe is the truth about reality. Outside the cave is the real world, and so on. So fill that out and use it to describe your own life. And that's the discussion 1 intro. What cave did you come out of? Let's take a look at what Plato meant. So in Plato's Republic, he had a very specific meaning. He wanted to use it to convey his metaphysics. Remember, that's his theory of reality. And also his epistemology. Remember, that's his idea about how we know what reality is. So if you look at this table that I've put together for you here, this at the top is the released prisoners outside looking at the sun. And down here at the bottom is the chained prisoners inside looking at the shadows on the wall. And so there is a progress from being the chained prisoners to being the released. And so in metaphysics for Plato, the very highest form of reality he calls the ideal form of the good. And so the ideal form of the good has different instantiations. There's the beautiful, that's the good in the realm of aesthetics. In the realm of morals, the good is justice. The highest form of the good is justice, to live in a just society. And so Plato believes that that is real, independent of, check this out, particular physical objects like a just society. Of course, societies are more or less just as they are instantiated in the real world, as we would call it. But for Plato, the real world is a realm of forms or ideals or essences out beyond particular concrete material societies that we live in. So there's this outside the cave is abstractions, and inside the cave is more concrete from the point of view of metaphysics. And then in terms of epistemology, the highest form of knowledge represented by the sun is knowledge of the truth, which is based on logic and reason. And remember from the video, the discussion of the Socratic method, using reason to ask questions to try to get at the truth about reality. We'll see that's what Socrates does and what gets him in trouble and gets him put on trial, which is one of the lectures coming up. And then down in the cave is belief. So notice the difference between not everything you believe counts as knowledge. Our beliefs are based on our firsthand sensory perception or also on rhetorical tactics, the ways in which people frame things to persuade us of certain things. And of course, beneath our beliefs, there is the possibility of illusions based on distortions, fantasy, secondhand opinions. And that's represented in the allegory of the cave by the people saying, oh, I know what that shadow is. I know what's coming next in the series of shadows. Okay, so here's a historical interpretation of the allegory of the cave. Outside the cave would be um, the modern knowledge of reality, that is, that the earth rotates around the sun. That's called heliocentrism, sun-centeredness. And down in the cave, the shadows on the wall is the religious dogma from before and during the Renaissance, when it was believed all the way back to the ancient world that the earth is at the center and that it does not move. That's called geocentrism. And so when I talk about a paradigm shift, there's a paradigm shift from this religious view inside the cave. The pathway out is experimental science. The escapees would be like Galileo, Copernicus, Descartes, and that would be to come to the truth that scientific rationality reveals to us, which is heliocentrism. So this is just showing you another interpretation using these symbols to give an interpretation. There's an extra credit opportunity coming up to use this framework to tell me what's going on in Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth. So how does an allegory work as a persuasive rhetorical device? It makes a distinction. Philosophy makes a distinction. Philosophers make a distinction between philosophy, which is rational deliberation with a truth-seeking aim. You're trying to get at the truth. Whereas rhetoric is the use of language with the aim of persuading to win the argument, regardless of what the truth is. It may be in sync with the truth. It may not be in sync with the truth. So if your goal is to persuade people that philosophy or logos is superior to mythology, mythos, how should you tell the story? Well, according to Plato's allegory, you want everything that's symbolized up outside the cave in the light associated with positive values, and everything that you put down inside the cave and in the dark associated with negative values. Notice these associations in our ordinary language that align with this kind of value system that's incorporated into this rhetorical device of the allegory. Down in the dirt, up in the clear blue skies. After the Dark Ages came the Enlightenment. Oh, you're so in the dark. Oh, he or she is really bright. They are really bright. God is up in heaven. The devil is down in hell. Cavemen are ignorant. That's a reference, to the ethnocentrism of the School of Life video. Humans are above other animals in the animal kingdom. So you can probably think of your own examples, but I'm just showing you that we can find in our ordinary language ways in which up, outside, and light are associated with positive values, and down and inside, dark, are associated with negative values. So I want to ask you now, do you think that this is a thinking question? Is the allegory a neutral device? Can it be used to persuade you of both sides in an argument? Or does it lead to the truth? And so here is evidence that the allegory is a neutral device. Below, I'm going to give you two interpretations of opposing narratives that illustrate how it could be used to reach opposing conclusions about the same thing, in this case, sobriety. Okay, so according to interpretation A, the sun is the light of the sober truth. Whereas according to interpretation B, the truth is revealed by maybe like drugs, psychedelic, weed, wine. That's when you know the truth. And notice how down in the cave on interpretation A, that's where mind-altering substances are said to be good. Shadowcasters would be pushers, the prisoners would be users, and inside the cave would be the drug and alcohol culture. How do you get out? The pathway out from this interpretation is the 12-step program. Notice on this other interpretation, the 12-step program is down in the cave, admitting that you're powerless. The pushers, the shadowcasters are Bob and recovering alcoholics, and the prisoners are 12-steppers and quitters, right? And so inside the cave is reality unmediated. Outside the cave, which you get to, according to this interpretation, through opening the doors of perception, as Aldous Huxley once said. You go to Burning Man, you get high, and you see the truth. You wake up with your head on a cactus, and you're like, oh, I get it. So what I'm trying to show you here is that neither of these interpretations is the truth about sobriety. These are two different interpretations. So in the upcoming essay, I'm going to ask you to use the allegorical framework, regardless of which way you're going to argue in your paper. And I'm showing you here, it can be used to argue either way, to support an argument either way. Let's talk a little bit more about what rhetoric is. So it's a mode of communication. An allegory, as I said, is a symbolic narrative that's used to try to persuade people who are listening to your argument. But rhetoric concerns not the reason or the logic, but how something is said, the language, the metaphor, the analogy. It's not what is said, but how it is said. So rhetoric is about form, not content. Kant once said of rhetoric that it's the art of deceiving by the means of beautiful illusion. Plato calls it eloquent language used by orators to persuade the demos, the people, the masses. So you've probably heard of a rhetorical question. A rhetorical question is one posed without any exception and any expectation of reply. It's asked in a way that makes the answer appear obvious. So those are some uses of the term rhetoric. So what is the philosopher's critique of rhetoric? Well, from a philosophical point of view, the ideal of rational argumentation, of making a rational argument, an argument that has reason, logic behind it, is free of rhetoric. Other people argue that no language or communication is free of rhetoric, that it is impossible or even unnecessary to get the rhetoric out of our arguments. But philosophers worry that rhetoric can be used to excite emotions and passions which override our reason. And the folks in the ancient world, in the context who taught rhetoric, they would be called communications professors today. In that context, were called sophists. And they taught rhetoric to democratic citizens to help them win the argument. Ancient Athens was a democracy, but the people didn't have college and university to learn how to make good arguments. So there were these teachers that traveled around, and they would teach the sons of democratic citizens. It was a patriarchy, of course, although some women did have the ability to speak in the agora, in the polis, the political sphere. Okay, so the sophist is accused by the philosopher of loving the people, the demos, rather than loving logic. Remember, philosophy is the love of wisdom, the love of logic, rational truth. The orator who uses rhetoric speaks on behalf of winning rather than on behalf of the truth, regardless of the truth in some cases. So the philosopher worries that rhetoric is manipulative, whereas reason respects free thinking. And another feature of rhetoric is that it is monological. It's given in speeches rather than dialogical, where we attempt to, like the Socratic method, where we attempt to work out our different viewpoints through a back and forth dialogical approach. Okay, so here's the question. If Plato is critical of rhetoric, he's a philosopher, then why does he use it? This allegory is in the middle of his book on justice. Think about that for a second. On one view, he might be seen to be a hypocrite. But on another view, and this is the view we'll take in the class, he might be making an important distinction. Since for Plato, the passions and reason can and should work in harmony, he doesn't think we should be dispassionate. He just thinks that our passions should be governed by reason. It's okay to use rhetoric alongside logic and reason to convey what we have already revealed to be true, to help people see the light of truth. This would be called a good faith use of rhetoric. On the other hand, what Plato would be against is when it's used to convey lies, myths, when it is inconsistent with logic and reason, when it is used to persuade people of untruths. That would be called a bad faith use of rhetoric. So in your essay, you will be asked to use Plato's allegory of the cave to support your thesis, to frame your essay. And the prompt includes this particular instruction: use the allegory of the cave to provide a favorable rhetorical framework for your essay. And so I've given you that framework, symbolic framework worksheet to begin to work out in your essay who's in the cave and who's out in the sun, right? So the philosopher that is living the examined life, that's the path to the good life. And on this view, if you argue for this, that the philosopher is living the good life, then you would say that the people who believe in the examined life are like the escapees in Plato's allegory. But if you begin to detect that this itself is propaganda, this is bunk, and you begin to take the standpoint of the people, the sophists, that the democratic citizenry, that the examined life is not the path to the good life. Instead, we must play to win. We have to debate it out to determine what the truth is. It's not given in the realm of the forms. It's something we decide on the ground in our concrete dialogical discussions with one another. So if you take this view in your essay, the people who believe in the examined life are like the cave dwellers in Plato's allegory of the cave. So we have a lot of work to do before we get to that essay. This is just our step one in a process of getting to the essay. We have to talk about what the good life means. And we have to talk more about Socrates and what he stood for and how he defined this concept we're going to be examining called the examined life. So if this essay was difficult for you, if this lecture was difficult for you, I encourage you to return to the reading now, having had the lecture, and even listen to the lecture twice to make sure that you have it down before moving on. All right, thanks for joining me. Take good care and study hard.